David, and hi to everyone today in the Great Carrying Stream Festival. So I went up to a little trepidation in coming at this, not due to the subject matter, which is someone that I've been thinking about a lot for nigh on 40 years, but to the knowledge and experience of so many people sitting here, including many previous lecturers in this occasion, from whom I have learnt so much, and of course to the stature and perhaps the girth of Eberhard Paddy Bort, because he did so much to raise the game on our understanding of Hamish Henderson. And he, like Henderson, was a passionate European. And I'm very conscious of that heritage in choosing today's subject, Hamish Henderson, Scotland in Europe and Europe in Scotland. And it's also lovely to have the family here today with us. Fantastic. Now, just in a small thing, I'm not going to go on talking about Hamish. I'm going to refer to Hamish Henderson, or even to the Gilly Moor, because sometimes I think to get the full stature of something, you need a little bit of distance. Now, first of all, I have to say that for my own part, I have never been entirely happy with the moniker Hamish Henderson, father of the folk revival. It's a bit like calling Patrick Geddes father of modern town planning. There's a truth there, but only a partial truth. It's not so much the folk revival bit, although for me the word revival is a word that poses more questions than answers, but perhaps the father of. Though, of course, in personal life, Hamish Henderson was the proud father of 2 daughters. It was to me someone who seemed to get younger in spirit as he got older. Never, I think, the patriarch. And there is something more also than the folk revival going on here. And I want to try, in the while we have together this afternoon, to turn to European cultural tradition to help us perhaps understand a little bit of that more. So first of all, clearly Hamish Henderson was a European intellectual, a child of Apollo. Widely read in the classics, in German, in French and Italian. You can see the influence of the German Enlightenment, J.G. Herder and all the rest, prominent in his own essays. While, as I think most of us know, one of his most sustained intellectual engagements was with the Italian Sardinian communist Antonio Gramsci. And he devoted a huge amount of time and effort into translating Gramsci's prison letters from the 1930s. Why? Well, you'll see almost everywhere cited the fact that Gramsci was one of the few left-wing thinkers to be interested in popular or folk culture, hence Henderson's interest. But if you actually read the Gramsci prison letters and notebooks, as I did this summer on an epic train journey across Europe, just to go and hear Steve Burns sing, and I could have just waited and heard him today. But it was very good, it was very good. And you'll find that the references to folk culture are really kind of in the passing. They're not Gramsci's major focus. And during these prison years, deprived of his normal political journalism, his campaign to try and unite the Italian left in opposition to Mussolini, hence the clink, what Gramsci is really exploring is history. The history particularly of the role of intellectuals in Italian history and society. And essentially, I suppose, he's wondering how come that all that hope and renewal of the 19th century Risorgimento ended up with fascism. And he comes up with two tentative but ongoing answers that I think become of real significance for Hamish Henderson. And the first one is the conservative influence of religion through the Roman Catholic Church on Italian society. And secondly, the failure of Italian intellectuals to align with the social and cultural realities of the mass of the population. Instead, their adherence to middle-class values, privileges, and perceptions, therefore belonging to a class-bound culture. Now, it's that broader picture that I think Hamish Henderson saw as applying to Scotland, not just the folk culture bit. So take the religion first. Hamish Henderson was persistent in his attack on the stultifying effect of Calvinism in Scotland. Even when others argued he didn't actually have his historical facts on the Reformation wholly right. But in his view, Calvinism had undermined creativity and confidence and encouraged social and political conformity in Scotland. And in my view, that analysis still has relevance, because despite the decline of institutional religion, we are still very much under the control and sway of the secular Calvinists in Scotland, who believe in the predestination of management so-called science. Only management process, in their view, can govern or determine collective social action, cultural, economic, or whatever. So managing a hospital takes priority over medicine. Managing a university is apparently more important than education, and managing a church more important than theology or religion. Whereas managing local authority services counts above the well-being and democratic self-determination of people. In fact, all that kind of human diversity is deeply messy and awkward and has to be managed. And so I think that Hamish's analysis of the Scottish situation coming from Gramsci continues to be of interest. And what about the role of the Scottish intellectuals? The teachers, the ministers, the writers, the broadcasters, the journalists, the politicians. The reason that Hamish Henderson was so disliked by the middle class establishment in Scotland was that, a la Gramsci, he accused them of ignoring the culture and conditions of the majority of the Scottish population. And instead, they aligned with their own middle-class privileges and perceptions. So Scottish self-understandings had been consistently subordinated to a sense of Britishness, state and empire, to which many toadied in fairly nauseating, snobbish and flagrantly self-interested ways. And that may be a dark wood we're not wholly out of yet. And the point was that that critique was coming from someone whose war service to Britain in the great years of crisis was second to none, and who in many ways seemed himself to be connected with that sense of class privilege. So it's no wonder that in that context you have to understand the attempt to sideline Hamish Henderson by keeping him off the airwaves, a medium in which clearly he would have excelled and had huge influence. And so you wonder, is that still a relevant critique, Gramsci to Hamish Henderson to Scotland? Well, of course, there have been huge advances in the study of Scottish history and literature, and in Scottish democracy. But there is still an extraordinary resistance, an almost outraged resistance, to the idea that those holding senior positions in Scottish institutions, not least cultural institutions, should be knowledgeable about Scottish society and culture. And that, I would have thought, was a kind of self-evident requirement that has absolutely nothing to do with ethnicity or nationality. And while the BBC critique, by and large, our British Broadcasting Corporation has continued to serve up Scotland with a mainstream dosage of cultural and intellectual pap. We may finally be about to see some real change there because of political pressure and because of Ofcom's, now a regulator for the BBC, new requirement that there be some meaningful relationship between licence fee revenue from Scotland and production investment in Scotland. We shall see. I find it interesting that none of the BBC's later, much delayed catch-up on the significance of Hamish Henderson has mentioned that critique. So, Hamish Henderson, the European intellectual, having this dialogue with Gramsci extended, developed his own distinctive position on Scottish culture and intellectual life, which I think remained pretty consistent for the rest of his own long career of teaching, writing, and activism. It has got real intellectual stature and bite. And of course, if we say that Henderson was a child of Apollo, a European intellectual, we know, of course, that in all he was about, he was also a child of Orpheus, a poet and a songmaker of European stature, as we've already heard, bridging the worlds of literature and popular culture in the manner of the long great European tradition of poetry and song. Poetry and sang, gang the giver. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this aspect because previous speakers, including Fred Freeman and Raymond Ross, have covered all that and written about that so well, and I think that perhaps this is the side of Hamish Henderson's European legacy that is best known. So I'm going to pass on, acknowledging that if Henderson was a child of Apollo and Orpheus, he was also the son of Dionysus, a believer in the Bacchanal. The free-flow, ceilidh conviviality of music, verbal repartee, story and song, and indeed of shaking the thyrsus, dancing with the hobby horse, or whatever the seasonal occasion might be. Now that, of course, often, usually, involved drink, and many people often, usually, got drunk, including Hamish Henderson. Yet, you know, putting the stress in all that on alcohol rather than on the collective consciousness of the Dionysiac is mistaken. It's reminiscent a little bit of the early biographers of Burns, who set up depicting him as an alcoholic when in fact Burns was physiologically unable to match even the average alcohol consumption of his contemporaries. No, surely the Bacchic impulse is about release, celebration and collective energy. A folk spirit, in Tim Neat's words, that concentrates and develops the collective joy of social groups. This is not Calvinism. when that benevolent collective release and energy is absent, other forces occupy that collective space, religiously, politically, psychologically. Calvinism, fascism, and the result is to disempower and even to demonize. So that Cayley spirit remains, in my view, at the heart of the Hamish Henderson influence and legacy. Folk song, yes, of course, but it's also the context, the flow, the Cayley spirit, the participation that really counts. And at every opportunity, Hamish Henderson, as I would recall, practiced what he preached on this matter. So just one little personal memory, which in 1979, a year when I actually had 3 encounters, important encounters for me with Hamish Henderson in a fairly decisive year, 1979. The third of these was on an occasion when Odysseus Elatus, the Greek poet, had been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. And Elatus, of course, had been exiled from Greece and was a key figure in the resistance to the Greek dictatorship. He was awarded the Nobel Prize, and the Hellenic Society, so that's the modern Greek, not the classical Greek, threw a party to celebrate. And who did they ask to be the Fair-and-Tie, the host of the occasion? Hamish Henderson. And I don't think I will ever forget the impact, arriving, as it were, through my kind of classics bit and interested in Greek literature, to land in the middle of this flow of different languages, of poetry, of song, of music, and at the centre of it, this extraordinary white-maned figure with this slightly kind of academic at points intonation, but also clearly the focus, the fulcrum, the energy point of this whole fantastic occasion. An absolutely European and international Cayley. Now, in all that, there is, I think, a religious and almost shamanic element. The Fairen or the Bien-and-Tie must mix the elements and lead the participants on a journey. And I think that there was at time a shamanic element to Hamish Henderson. That distinctive physical shape, the slight bobbing, the slight lurching posture, that cross-class accent, the constant push towards the collective release, the choric song, a psychological nurture, and even perhaps a healing in the heart of the Cayley spirit. And that leads me to another part of Scotland's European heritage, in which I believe Hamish Henderson is significant, the religious. For in the broadest sense, Hamish Henderson was also a child of Christos, a wounded healer. And here is something that was very little talked about in relation to the father of the folk revival, until Tim Neate's wide-ranging research for his epic biography showed the important and mainly positive influence of the Episcopal Anglican Church on Hamish Henderson's upbringing. Because in a way, the church became, to an orphaned youngster, a parent, a sanctuary. And he never lost a sense of connection with that Christian tradition, in its broadest sense, that put love and free will first. And the most important thing in all its forms, Hamish Henderson was to reflect in his own unpublished journals, the most important thing was and continued to be love. But there is, I think, even more to it than that. Hamish Henderson had lost his mother and had fought through 2 brutal military campaigns in North Africa and then up through Sicily and Italy. He came back from the war, as so many servicemen did then and have since, traumatised to a degree by the violence and destruction he had witnessed. And it's interesting, here we are on 11/11, born 11/11. And you see Henderson working through all that in his poetic elegies, in search, if you like, of a sense of healing and renewal, a coming to terms, a reconciliation with what he had experienced. And to a real degree, he found that sense of healing and renewal among the Scottish travelling people. Now, those relationships went far beyond folklorist or collector. And characteristically, it's Sheila Stewart, quoted by Tim, that touches the heart of it directly. This is Sheila. Hamish told us about the homes he was in. He had a hard life, but he said it wasn't hard like the travellers had, living in tents, with every hand against them. He had the grieving for his mother, but we had the tinker's curse. It was Hamish who drew us back to the fire. It was Hamish who drew us back to the fire. Wounded healer. And I think that that underlies many of the friendships that Hamish Henderson had. The time he spent listening to younger people, sharing his own experiences, shaping cultural objectives, influencing lives, as Scotland gradually reshaped itself. And those words at the end of the 6th elegy always echo in my mind. So the words I have looked for and must go on looking for are worlds of whole love, which can slowly gain the power to reconcile and heal. Other words would be pointless. Words, worlds, words. Worlds of whole love, which can slowly gain the power to reconcile and heal. But even then, perhaps, we have not plumbed the whole depths. Son of Apollo, the intellectual, Orpheus, the muse, Dionysus, the ecstatic, Christos, the healer. Did Hamish Henderson ever lay claim to any of those inheritances? Lived them, yes. Claimed them, no. Because he was the son of who? Who was Hamish Henderson's father? We don't know. Tim Neate, in the biography, plays a careful twin track in his monumental work, laying out in the main text the evidence for Hamish Henderson being an illegitimate son of the Henderson whose name he bore. But then, in an appendix, Tim persuasively presents some points in favour of Hamish Henderson being an illegitimate son of the Duke of Atholl, with the Henderson attribution perhaps being a useful version of events for all parties at the time, and then subsequently for Hamish Henderson during his early childhood. One interesting thing about all that is that either way, Perthshire's at the centre of it. That's something I think it's good to hear the song, because I think Perthshire is important, and incidentally it's very wonderful that this weekend's Carrying Stream for the first time has events in Blairgowrie and Rattray going on this afternoon and this evening. And I think that's a very, very welcome thing to see Hamish Henderson celebrated by the community of Persia. Now, all of that is fascinating stuff biographically, but maybe not as important as might at first appear. Because if Hamish Henderson favoured any inheritance or identity, it was surely anonymous. Son of nobody and everybody, father of none and everyone. And that very woundedness of Henderson's vocation feeds into the emotional power of his art and his personality. But so does the hiddenness of key aspects of his own life and origins. Anonymity, or at least a lack of self-definition, of hard self-definition, is desirable because it keeps open the channels of connection. It allows the flow of the bardic gift and the spirit of the Cayley. And when that gift fails, it is time to surrender life itself back to the flow. And that perhaps explains some of that passive thread that weaves through the later years of Hamish Henderson, and especially through the late great poem, Under the Earth I Go. Under the earth I go, on the oak leaf I stand, I ride on the filly that never was foaled, and I carry the dead in my hand. There's method in my magic. Seeing I have passed my sell-by date, and will no doubt be hanging up my clogs quite soon, I've come back to Padstow to dance, to dance. Dawdle of drums on a May morning, slash of sunlight on hill and harbour, hijacked greenwood louping along the quay, to hell with Aunt Ursula Birdhood and her old yow deed in the park. While my love lives, I'll dance with the mares, teasing the old oss till there's new life in him, chasing sweet lusty spring with pipes, goatskin and bones. Sun showers over the estuary, cormorant black on the pale sands yonder, taste of dank earth on my tongue, trembling oak leaves courting the sun, and the twin dragons, life and death, jousting together under the maypole. Change elegy into hymn. Remake it. Don't fail again. Like the potent sap in these branches, once bare and now brimming with routh of green leavery, remake it and renew. Macker ye maun sing them, cantos of exploit and dream, Dane of desire and fulfilment, balance of fire and red flambeau. Tomorrow songs will flow free again, and new voices be born on the carrying stream. Asleep in spring sunshine, Cornish river banks flower again. Back in Fyvie's lands, I'll say farewell with the Plumen's week. Sure Monday, cold Tuesday, cruel Wednesday, everlasting Thursday. On Friday will you ne'er get doon? Sweet Saturday and the afternoon, glorious Sunday, rest forever. Amen. Apollo, Dionysus, Orpheus, Christ, Anonymous, all in there. Europe and Scotland, Scotland in Europe, Europe and Scotland in the world and in the cosmos. And the dance, the poetry, the song, the social joy, the healing transformations, the carrying stream. It's over to us, friends, the children of Hamish Henderson, sons and daughters of Anonymous. Amen. Amen. Thank you very much.